All right. All right. And today is Unit 2, Lesson 2, Interpret Tables. And a lot of what we're looking at here, sort of continuing on with the same idea that we were using or when we were looking at maps, we're going to move into some different forms of data and information and interpreting that information in different ways. So largely, you think about this the same way as the map, lessons. Just we're visualizing that information in a different way now through tables. So let's take a look here. And yeah, so it says we're going to identify a table, and then we'll use that and interpret the information presented in those tables. All right. And a little bit of audio. Here we go.
One way to present facts, statistics, and other details in a clear, well-organized manner is to use a table. Tables allow authors to visually present information that might be too lengthy or complex to describe in a narrative passage. Tables organize information into rows and columns. Rows run across the table from the left to the right. Columns run up and down the table, from the top to the bottom. Reading the title of a table, as well as the headings for its rows and columns, can help you interpret and use the information presented in the table.
Yeah, and an easy way to remember, which direction the rows and the columns go. If you think of columns, like columns on a building, they are up and down, they're vertical. So the columns run up and down in a table, and rows, just like rows in a movie theater or like a stadium, are go left to right. And so, yeah, again, we're, visualizing information in a new way. Same kind of idea, we're going to be looking at some historical sort of data and information that we apply to the table. And like it says here, it's a good way, just like a map, when you have a lot of information and it's not effective to put in a bunch of text, right, to explain that information. You got to find other ways to get that to your reader, to present it to your reader. So, maps is one way. We talk about geographic information, right? That's a perfect way to show geographic information. Tables are great for, a variety of numerical information. So population, which we'll see in our examples, or, is it certain economic activities and things like that. That's a good way to show that data, especially if you're showing, tables will often show some sort of progression or, an increase or decrease. So like chronological, will have like a list of years, or maybe a percent gain, if you're looking at some type of like investment or something like that. And it's going to show us here too. I think there's going to be another audio clip after this, but our first table here, and always, remember to take into account the title, and they're going to be really important when you talk about data like this. So it says here, the title can be found above a table. Sometimes it's below the table or in the first row of the table. So the title identifies the subject or the topic of the title or of the table, just like every, just whether it's a article you're reading or a map, same kind of idea expressed there. And then our columns here, it's showing the headings of each column or row identify the information located in that part of the table. So in our left-hand column, we have year. And then in the right-hand column is population. And then through our rows, we'll have each individual year, and then I'll show the population for that given year. And what we're dealing with here is the estimated population of the Virginia colony. So we've mentioned this a little bit in talking about that in social studies, as far as like when people started coming to North America from Europe. And the Virginia colony, it was started in 1607 with the Jamestown settlement. And that actually predates the arrival of the Pilgrims, traditionally, and just with like Thanksgiving, we just had Thanksgiving, and we think about this tradition of the Pilgrims and the first Thanksgiving, but we often overlook and we tend to forget that Jamestown in Virginia was actually the first British, well, they emphasize that, colony in North America, and it started in 1607. So then the table we have here shows the population increase over the first, let's see here, like 150 years. And we see an incredible growth in population there from 2,500 in 1630 up to 538,000, which would have been right around, right towards the end of the American Revolution. And of course, a lot of that growth in the beginning is going to be from just people coming here from across the Atlantic. And it's not going to be until later where, you'll by the more towards the 1700s and late 1700s is where that's going to be a natural population growth based on, people here, and the birth rate going up. But you can see just, between these years, just the amount of growth, the growth explosion that we had here. All right, so, yep, and this is basically going to run down exactly how to interpret that data when we get into our questions in the quiz and the workbook.
On the GED test, you have to read and interpret tables and other types of graphics. Let's practice reading and interpreting a table to answer a question. This question asks, the details in the table support which of the following conclusions? Option A. Many people left Virginia to settle in other colonies between 1700 and 1750. Option B. Virginia's colonial population peaked before 1750. Option C. The population of Virginia doubled every 20 years between 1630 and 1690. Option D. Virginia's population grew significantly between 1630 and 1780. The best way to analyze this question and the potential answers is to consider each option. Option A. Many people left Virginia to settle in other colonies between 1700 and 1750. When you look at the population column for the years 1700, 1720, 1740, and 1750, you can see that the population increased each year. The information in the table does not support Option A. Option B. Virginia's colonial population peaked before 1750. Based on the table, the population for 1750 in Virginia was 231,000 people. When you compare this figure with the population for other years, you can conclude that the population in 1750 was more than any other year prior, but less than the years that followed. So, Option B is not the correct answer. Option C. The population of Virginia doubled every 20 years between 1630 and 1690. To analyze this option, you have to look how much the population increased in each 20-year span, or over each row. If any increase is more or less than double the previous amount, this option would be incorrect. In 1630, you can see that the population was 2,500. In 1650, the population was 18,700. So, the population more than doubled in the first 20-year span. Option C is not correct. Option D. Virginia's population grew significantly between 1630 and 1780. Based on the table, you can see that Virginia's population grew from 2,500 in 1630 to 538,000 in 1780. That is a significant increase. Option D is the correct answer.
Yeah, so basically, a lot of it is going to be a process of elimination, and always not making assumptions about what the table says, because some of those, right, if you look at them, sort of make sense, but we don't have that information in the table. So you have to be very careful with looking at those answers and seeing, does that actually say that in the table. And here, the best answer, it's actually a little more broad, but D, being Virginia population grew significantly between 1630 and 1780, that fits, right? There's no question there. There's no wiggle room. It's certainly broad, but it certainly fits both columns and rows there. Okay. Okay, now we'll go into the quiz. So lesson 2, unit 2, onto the quiz. Hit start. Okay. And right into our same table, estimated population of the Virginia colony. And I believe our first question, well, let's see, what's our test taking tip here? It says the headings of a table's rows and columns determine how the information is related in these sections. Notice that the year in each row corresponds to the population number to the right. Right, so it runs chronologically from 1630 to 1780, and then the population corresponds with each year. So you're reading that left to right. Okay, and looks like the same question we had before. So the details in the table support which of the following conclusions? And we already know that answer, right? It's D as in dog. And she gave us a pretty good explanation of how we track that information and come to that conclusion. All right. So number 1, D as in dog. And we'll get a new table here. So again, dealing with migration into North America, into the American colonies specifically. So the title here, Origins of Migrants to American Colonies from 1700 to 1750. So a little more condensed time. And what we're going to have here is the location on the left column, right? And then the totals in the right-hand column. So in Africa, or from Africa, the number of total migrants was 278,400. And from Ireland, 108,600. From Germany, 84,500. From England and Wales, 73,100. From Scotland, 35,300. And then our other category, which is fairly small, is 5,900. So a total migration of 585,800 from 1700 to 1750. So in about 50 years' time, the population increased from migration in the American colonies to 585,800. And our first question here is, based on the table, from which location other than Africa did the greatest number of immigrants come? So what's our answer there?
Ireland.
Ireland, right? And so this is probably a good time to mention this too, right? In this case, the columns are organized by the total, right? We see a descending number there from 278,000 down to 5,900. You have to be careful which way it's organized. They could have organized it, say, alphabetically by the location, which would, wind up, moving those numbers around. So they wouldn't be in numerical order or in a descending order like that. So just be careful when you're looking at it. In this case, they're making it a little easy for us because we can just look and see that second number. But keep that in mind, the way the tables are organized sometimes, what you're looking for. And it's going to be fill in the blanks. So Ireland, Ireland, is the correct answer for number 2. Okay, so moving on to number 3. So the immigration of 278,400 Africans to the American colonies between 1700 and 1750 was likely due to blank. What is the reason for that large migration?
For greener pastures?
Did you say slavery?
No.
I'm sorry, what?
Greener pasture.
Oh, greener pastures. Unfortunately, no. They're including slavery in this migration.
Slavery.
Yeah, so
Okay.
if you look at that number, I would guess that nearly 100% of that 278,400 quote unquote migrants, that's a forced migration due to slavery. So it's kind of making you, it's going to bring this up later. You know, it's going to make us rely a little bit on some of the previous lessons and things we've learned. So we talked about, you know, the Atlantic slave trade some in past lessons, and it's going to kind of make you draw on that a little bit in order to think about that. So we know, you know, most of the colonies were settled by Europeans, particularly Britain. And then we see, like, you know, the Irish and Germans and this and that came later. And then, you know, when you see a number like that, it's going to make you think. It's like, okay, what's driving that number? So slavery for number 3, SLAVERY. And I think maybe one day I'll play. I posted that video on the ships coming from Africa to the New World, the slave ships. And the video only takes about 2 minutes, so I'm going to find it again one day and we'll watch it. And it's just incredible. Like, there's just all these dots of these ships. By the time we get in, it's particularly like the late 1600s and into the 1700s, of all these slave ships coming from Africa into the New World. But anyway, back to our quiz. So yeah, slavery for number 3, and another table. So we're comparing here Britain and the 13 colonies when it came to resources for the American Revolution. So, you know, how we fought. So some of the elements that were in play during the American Revolution for both sides. So, you know, we have Britain in our left-hand column, the 13 colonies in our right-hand column. Our rows are for population, money, army, leaders, location. So population, first off, Britain, fairly well populated by the time of the American Revolution in the later 1700s. 12 million people residing in Britain. Combined, the 13 colonies, we had about 2.8 million people living in the 13 colonies during the American Revolution. So just a fraction of the population of Britain. Money, I've mentioned this before, by this time, Britain is the world power. It is the dominating force in the world. It controls most shipping around the world. It is a sea power. You know, Britain's a little island, but they were great shipbuilders and very astute naval, were very adept with naval technology and building a navy. And that's really where their empire succeeded the most. And as a result, they were the richest country in the world due to trade, due to their colonies. They had all the money. 13 colonies, no money to support the war effort. It was even difficult to raise taxes at that time to support the war effort. Very little. So a lot of our money came from France, were loans from France. A lot of our wartime goods were French. The army, in our third row here, large, well-trained army. The British Army was the most professional, well-trained, well-equipped army in the world at that time. We also fought a fraction of that army because they were deployed all over the world in various skirmishes and things. So when we talk about defeating Britain, we really only faced a small part of their army and their military. And then the 13 colonies, they were willing, they wanted to fight, very poorly equipped, and it was basically an all volunteer force. We didn't conscript soldiers, right? We didn't have a draft until much later. We started drafting some during the Civil War, but then selective service didn't come around until World War I, where all males over the, healthy males over the age of 18 would sign up for selective service, and then you may or may not get drafted, which ended right after the Vietnam War. So it was very difficult to raise an army to fight. And then leadership, our leaders in our fourth row. So many skilled officers, just, as a professional army, they had schools to train their officers. They were well educated. And then the 13 colonies, few officers capable of leading. We just didn't have the training. We didn't have that professional military education for our soldiers. And most of their experience came from the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian Wars, it's called. It was in the 1760s, like George Washington, that got his military experience there. So experience was a problem. And then location. So for Britain, they had, I mentioned this too, the Atlantic is a great barrier between the North America and any enemies. It takes a long time to get here. So it's a vast, strange land for Britain without nearby supplies, right? Most of their supplies are going to come from overseas. So that's always an issue. Of course, they can always get stuff from Canada too, since that was a British colony as well. And for the 13 colonies, it was familiar land. They didn't have to worry about travel, right? They're fighting there on their home turf. But even still, the supplies were limited. They could rely on farms to some degree and things like that. But, all in all, not a lot of money to support the American effort in the war. Okay, so based on the table then, which of the following look like the most likely outcome of the war? A, the colonies would win. B, the British would win. C, a truce would be declared. Or D, the 13 colonies would expand. B, right? So it did look like the British would win. They were the richest, most powerful, most well-organized military, all of that. And largely, they just gave up on us. They just figured we were more trouble than we were worth. And that's largely why King George just decided to, come to a truce. It just, Britain being Britain and being the most powerful country in the world had their hands in elsewhere, and we're getting more money and resources elsewhere. So it just didn't make sense to keep, throwing money at these 13 colonies to fight this war. So we just outlasted them. And that's basically how we gained our independence. All right, so number 4 is B, as in boy. And 5, our last one on the quiz here. So based on the table, in what area were the colonists most prepared? They had the most people. B, they had the largest budget. C, they had many trained military officers. Or D, they easily could locate their supplies.
They did have a lot of people, but I think it's D.
D, yeah, D is in dog. What little supplies they had, it was easy to move them. And right, it was familiar terrain. They knew the ins and outs of the colonies and how to move things, people. They did have
answer to 3.
the answer to 3. Yeah, 3 was slavery. So immigration of 278,400 Africans to the American colonies was likely due to slavery. That's number 5. That's the last one. I'll go ahead and submit the answers, and I'll run through all of them real quick. Okay. Also, one thing I want to mention here too, as we're looking. So number 1 was D, as in dog. If you're doing these on your own, say you miss class or you're going back and you're reviewing, keep in mind there's some great information when it gives you the answer, right? So right under here, it has this text box, and it's good for review. It'll give you the correct answer and it'll give you a reason for that answer. And it's the same thing for, every one of the classes, whether it's math, science, social studies, or language arts. So for review, a great little bit of information to look through to help sort of reinforce the ideas we're going through here. All right, so 1 was D as in dog, 2 is Ireland, 3 was slavery, 4 is B as in boy, and 5 was D as in dog. Okay, and that will lead us into the workbook. So sliding over to the workbook, Unit 2, Lesson 2. And then it restates our lesson here. Table presents important facts or details in a visual format. Rows run left to right, columns run up and down. By interpreting tables, you can draw conclusions about the subjects or topics presented. Tables can be read from top to bottom and from side to side, depending on how you're looking at the information. So be sure to determine what the headings for each column or row of the table mean. Carefully study the facts and details in the table. So just reinforcing that. Remember to look at your titles. Remember to look at the names of the rows and the names of the columns. Okay, and a small column here, or I'm sorry, a small table. So by refining the skills, you're going to improve your study and test taking abilities. These are going to be featured on the GED exam. Our title. So our text box, a text box, based on the title of the table, you can determine that the table will detail regional colonial agricultural products, right? Colonial agricultural by region. Definitely focusing, and you can see again how we're tying in that history aspect with our social studies. We did this with the maps. We're focusing in on that the era of colonialism in North America. So our title is Colonial Agriculture by Region, circa, which basically means estimated, about, so right around 1700. And here, B says tables are particularly useful for comparing information. In this case, the headings indicate that the table compares main crops grown in different regions of the colonies. New England, the middle colonies, and southern colonies. And I think when we switch over here to the workbook, I'm going to make sure that you guys understand, where those areas are a little more, we kind of somewhat understand, when we're talking about New England, when we're talking about middle colonies is a little different. And of course, the southern colonies. So I'll pull up a map. We'll take a quick look. Okay. And our text box here says land and climate played an important role in determining the types of crops that could be grown in each colonial region. Crops did not thrive in New England's cool climate and rocky soil. However, colonists did grow corn in the region. The milder climate and more fertile soil of the middle colonies allowed colonists there to produce many grains such as wheat, and the southern colonies also had fertile soil as well as a lengthy growing season. As a result, many planters built large plantations on which they raised cash crops such as tobacco, rice, and indigo. Does anybody know what indigo is? Any thoughts on that? So indigo is, you probably hear it referred to as collar, which is exactly what it was used for. It's a flowering plant, and there's several varieties, but it produces, a blue type of dye. And like the original, like now we use a lot of synthetic dyes, but like the original blue jeans, where they'd use an indigo dye from those plants. So that was one of the big crops at that time. Dye was really, they were really expensive. So like the British soldiers wore those red coats, and that was part of their professionalism because those weren't cheap. Dye wasn't cheap. One of the more rare colors was purple. So you'll hear like royal purple, because that tended to be the color of royalty, because those dyes were really expensive. It was a very, I think it was another plant that those came from. So, you know, it cost a lot of money to have something dyed purple at that time. So that's why we tend to think of that as a royal color. Okay, so we'll start the workbook now. And I'm going to try to pull up. So if I put New England colonies, let's see, we'll take a quick look here. If I can get an image for us. Okay, this is perfect right here. Let's see if I can get this map pulled up. And if my internet will work, come on now. No, it's not that slow. Well, maybe not this one. Let's go. Let's try this one. Maybe I can just open the image. There we go. Yeah. So this is a perfect breakdown. So the New England colonies are in that pinkish color. So Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. So when you hear the New England area, that's typically what they refer to. Middle colonies, New York, Vermont, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware. They have it broken into a fourth, Chesapeake colonies. I would probably, for our purposes, put middle colonies, Maryland and Virginia would, Virginia is probably considered a southern colony, and Maryland would be put into the middle colonies. So your dividing line would be right around here. And of course, the southern colonies always are going to be North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. So it might be a little bit subjective, where do you put Virginia? Oftentimes you're going to hear it referred to in the South. So kind of keep that in mind as we look at our table here for this information. Okay, and the same thing again, climate played a big role as far as what was grown where. And are using logic box here. So for some questions, you need to access prior knowledge. For example, which colonies were located in each region. This information is not presented on the page. You have to use what you already know about American history. So this is what I mentioned, we're building that knowledge. We're, keep in mind when we move from lesson to lesson that what we just encountered needs to be accounted for, right? You need to continue to process that information and be able to use it. And what we keep running into with social studies, as I've seen, is knowing your states. So it would be a good time to refresh yourself and look at a map and make sure, particularly for the U.S., that the location of the states. And I tell you, that's something that a lot of people have a difficulty with. I don't know if it's just not taught as much anymore. But knowing the location and names of states is just something that I think probably needs to be maybe focused on a little bit more in school, because a lot of people struggle with that. Okay, so moving on to question 1 here. So what was the main crop grown in the middle colonies? Was it A, corn, B, rice, C, indigo, or D, wheat?
D.
D, middle colonies. So middle colonies here, whoops, is wheat, because it had that milder climate. Now most of your wheat's going to be grown in the Midwest. So D is in dog for number 1. All right, our same table and our same text. So number 2, in which of the following colonies would crops have been the least likely to thrive? So A, Rhode Island, B, Georgia, C, Pennsylvania, and D, Virginia. So here,
A.
drawing on other information, right? Was that Grace? Did you
A.
have the answer?
Yeah, A.
A. Yeah, A,
Yeah.
Rhode Island. Yeah, so that's one of those things you have to think about. Okay, New England, Rhode Island, Georgia, South, Pennsylvania, Virginia, that middle colonies. So knowing that prior geography is going to be important. So A for number 2, Rhode Island. Rocky soil, not great for growing. Okay, and new table, colonial populations of enslaved people. So here, our first row is the colonies, right? Connecticut, New York, Maryland, Virginia, South Carolina. The second one we have, it's based on time. So the columns 1720, 1750, and 1770. And then our rows across will show the population of enslaved people there. So steady growth, obviously, between the year 1720 and 1770. Connecticut had the least amount. And again, we were organized here. The data is organized by increasing numerical, right? So Connecticut had the smallest number at every point. New York the next, Maryland the next. Virginia is actually the largest. And okay, so it's actually not necessarily completely numerical because South Carolina did not have as many at any time as Virginia did. So that's the one exception there is at the bottom where South Carolina did not have as many. All right, let's look at our question here. So based on the table, which statement is accurate? A, South Carolina's population of enslaved people doubled between 1720 and 1750. B, New England colonies typically had larger populations of enslaved people than the middle colonies. C, Virginia's population of enslaved people increased by more than 150,000 between 1720 and 1770. Or D, Connecticut's population of enslaved people began to decrease after 1750.
C.
Yeah, C is in cat.
Yes.
And yeah, so C. So this is, it follows along, and I think we might have a question here about it later on, but basically you didn't have the number of slaves in the northern colonies because they were largely, used, they were forced labor on farms and plantations. So those larger areas where you had the outside labor needed to plant and harvest and tend to those big crops. So like tobacco, rice, sugar, eventually cotton, all that. That's where the enslaved population was being worked. So that's just basically where you had your higher population of enslaved people. And which colony's population of enslaved people increased the least from 1720 to 1750? So A, South Carolina, B, New York, C, Maryland, D, Connecticut. So which,
D.
yeah, D is in dog, Connecticut. And again, rolling this information together, right? It's all about continuing that, kind of connecting the dots. We talked about that migration of enslaved people. Now we're dealing with where they were. Where did they come to once they got to North America? The when, where, why, and how questions, right? Why were they here? What were they doing? Where were they? So D, Connecticut, we know there was the least out of our table. People increased the least from 1720 to 1750. So D is in dog. Same table, which colony's population of enslaved people increased the most from 1720 to 1750? Was that A, New York, B, Virginia, C, Maryland, or D, South Carolina?
B.
Hey,
as in ball.
Virginia.
Right, B, as in boy, Virginia. And that's where I definitely, based on our previous table of the breakdown, they're gonna, I can see right now that they had put Virginia in the South because it's part of that Southern agriculture that used slaves for agricultural purposes. And 6, okay, so new table, estimated regional population of colonies. So back to that idea, New England, middle colonies, and southern colonies. And we're looking at the population around 1770, so a few years before the start of the American Revolution. And the text says, as the late 1700s approached, the British colonies began to grow at an extremely fast rate. In fact, by 1775, the colonial population would reach nearly 10 times the size it had been in 1700. Some of this growth resulted from continued immigration to the colonies. However, the bulk of this population growth was caused by very high birth rates and low death rates. So that's what I mentioned before, early on in the 1600s, it's a lot about people coming to the New World, coming to North America as immigrants. And then by the time we get to, the years before the American Revolution, now the birth rates have picked up, right? Because now we have people who are settled, they're established, right? It's safe. And not everybody's going to kill over because they don't have food, or disease and everything is a little bit lower. So lower death rates, higher birth rates are getting established through the 1700s, which makes the natural population rise as opposed to the immigrant population. And so number 6, based on information in the table, which statement accurately describes the middle colonies? A, the middle colonies have the smallest population. B, New York represented more than half of the middle colonies population. C, about 400,000 fewer people lived in the middle colonies than in the southern colonies. Or D, the middle colonies had a smaller average population per colony than England.
D as in dog.
D, it's actually C as in cat, because it is about 400,000 fewer people in the middle colonies than in the southern colonies. So the southern colonies were much larger. And so that population, it's not a dense population, it's spread out quite a bit, but it is larger than the New England and middle colony areas. So you figure North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, Georgia, those states, had a lot of place to live and set up these big agricultural centers and things like that. And we also know that the slave population, if they're including that, which I believe they are, is accounting for some of that population as well. Without the slave population, their southern colonies would look a little more like the middle and New England colonies. But C as in cat for number 6. And on to 7. Okay, so which of the following best accounts for the population growth in the colonies? A, colonies experienced natural increase due to birth and death rates. B, German and Scotch-Irish settlers began moving to the colonies. C, the health of colonists declined over time. Or D, many people moved to the colonies to find manufacturing jobs.
A.
A, yes. A, the colonies experienced natural increase. And that is specifically directly referenced in your text. So make sure that, when you're looking at your table, that you're reading the text and that you're finding that information there. So there's no guesswork. We don't really talk about German and Scotch-Irish. We don't talk about the health declining. And people move to the colonies to find manufacturing jobs. Well, this predates the Industrial Revolution, which we might talk about. I'm sure we'll talk about down the road here. But there's no mention of manufacturing jobs or anything like that in the text. So A is our answer there. All right, big table here. Lots of text. So this is Native American conflicts in colonial America. And there was a lot more than what we have here, but this is some of the more well-known and more violent ones, I guess you could say. Okay, so conflicts, region, and events and outcome. That's our three columns, right? And they're running in chronological order from the Pequot Revolt down to the raid on Kittanning. And so real quick, we'll read through here. So the Pequot Revolt from 1636 to 1637 was in the New England region. And our text passage says the conflict grows as colonists move west into Massachusetts and Connecticut. Colonists accuse a Pequot Indian of killing a settler, and they burn a Pequot village in retaliation. Pequot attack a Connecticut town. Settlers and Narragansett Indians then burn and destroy the Pequot's primary village. Many Pequot lose their lives. So, you know, this was almost inevitable when you had settlers come to North America. As they expanded their territory and encroach on Native American land, you're going to have friction between those groups and territory disputes, land disputes, which is exactly what happened basically from the time the Europeans arrived here all the way up through the 18th and honestly into the 20th century. There's been issues. And they often pitted various Native Americans against each other. So the Pequots were fighting against the Narragansett Indians as well. So that was often driven by, encroachment by Europeans, and they pitted these sides against, or they pitted Indian tribes against each other. So moving on, King Phillips War, 1675 to 1676 was a famous one as well in the New England area. Wampanoag Indians and other groups respond to encroachment on lands in southeastern Massachusetts with armed conflict. Many losses for colonists and Native Americans. Native American forces eventually weakened. Many Native Americans forced to leave their homes, which was typically the outcome as European settlers continued to expand their territory. The Yamasee War in 1715, our next row, occurred in the southern colonies. This was conflicts grows between colonists and Creek Indians seeking new lands. Colonists enlist help from Cherokee and Yamasee Indians to defeat the Creek Indians. So again, pitting Native American tribes against each other. And then raid on Kittanning in the middle colonies. So Pennsylvania colonists raid Delaware village of Kittanning, part of a series of violent conflicts between Native Americans and colonists over rights to land. And our first question there, based on the information in the table, the earliest conflict between Native Americans and the colonial Americans occurred in the region of
New England.
New England, yes. New England, N-E-W-E-N-G-L-A-N-D. That's number 8, England. Okay, and number 9. So during the Yamasee War, colonists fought the Creek Indians and defeated them with the help of the which tribes? So we have the Creek Indians here. Who were the other two?
Cherokee.
Yep.
And the one with the Y.
Cherokee and Yamasee.
Yeah, there you go.
So Cherokee. And Yamasee, Yamasee. I grew up thinking that I had Cherokee blood. My mother always told me that my great grandmother was Cherokee. And then I did a DNA test, and there is zero Native American blood in me whatsoever. Which it doesn't necessarily mean that I didn't have Cherokee, ancestor somewhere, but all of my DNA comes from Northern Europe. I'm good Viking stock, apparently. So Cherokee and Yamasee for number 9. But it also means I burst into flames when I get out in the sun. So according to information in the table, Pennsylvania colonists were involved in a battle in which Native American village? So
Delaware
Pennsylvania-
village of
what
Delaware
was that?
village of what? Delaware village of Kitanin or
Katanning. Yeah,
yeah.
there you go. Yeah, Katanning, Kittanning. So right here, Pennsylvania colonists raid Delaware village of Katanning, part of a series of violent conflicts between Native Americans. So Kittanning, Katanning. Okay. And number 11. So based on information in the table, conflicts between Native Americans and inhabitants of colonial America usually began over disputes about
Land.
land. Absolutely. Land. And there's a very cultural aspect to that. Europeans come from this idea where ownership, property ownership is a significant part of our understanding of wealth, our understanding of how economics work. Native Americans did not have that concept in the same way, so it was more of a communal understanding of land rights, and that was part of the friction between the two. Europeans were going to own that land, and it was going to belong to them, which started a lot of the tension between the sides. So 11 is land. And then 12, so which event occurred first? Either the settlers and Narragansett Indians destroyed the Pequot's village, or the Pequot attack a town in Connecticut. Which of those two events happened first?
Settlers in the end.
So the Pequots actually attack a town in Connecticut first. If you read through here, basically the colonists accuse a Pequot Indian of killing a settler, and they burned the Pequot village into retaliation. But what they're talking about here in the text is whether the settlers in Narragansett Indians destroy the Pequot village or the Pequots attack. So for this purpose, Pequot attack a Connecticut town happens before the Narragansett Indians get involved. So let's see if I can spell this all out here. It's the Pequot attack a town in Connecticut. I think that's right. I think it actually says it over here. So you can just basically, I don't know if you can copy. Can you copy and paste on this? I'll back that out and see if it'll let me copy and paste. Yeah, okay. So the Pequot attack a town in Connecticut. All right, that's number 12. And 13. So here, does the term Delaware refer to the Delaware colony or the Delaware tribe in the following phrase, Delaware village of Katanning? Does that mean colony or tribe?
The colony?
It's actually the tribe. It's one of those you kind of have to reason through. Tribe. So we're talking about Pennsylvania colonists, which kind of signals that we're still in Pennsylvania when we're talking about raids, and it's the Delaware tribe. It's a Delaware tribal village of Kittanning that's being attacked. That was a little bit tricky, but 13 is tribe. All right, new table, new text. So for number 14, our text says, while the original 13 colonies were united under British rule, each colonial region developed a different way of life. In New England, most colonists lived in towns. Some colonists in the region farmed, and others worked in industries such as fishing, shipping, lumber, and trade. In the middle colonies, people lived and worked on small farms. However, there were also large cities, such as Philadelphia and New York, in the region. Trade and some small industries were also important. The southern colonists featured many large plantations. Agriculture was the dominant economic activity in this region. And that's what our table represents, right? Regional differences here. And so, yeah, so New England shows our region. Our region column is New England, middle colonies. Southern colonies, again, our column for economy is showing, indicating agriculture, fishing, shipping, lumber, and trade for New England, agriculture, trade, and small industries for the middle colonies, and agriculture for southern colonies. And then settlement patterns were towns for New England, small farms, and some large cities for middle, and large plantations and small farms. So based on the table and the passage, which economic activity occurred in each region. And I believe I already got the answer in the text in the chat there is A, agriculture, right? So which economic activity occurred in each region? Agriculture, agriculture, agriculture in each one. The amount of which would have differed between all three, being more so a southern, most of their economy was agriculture, but it did occur in all three. Okay. So for 15, the second column of the table contains information about which topic. So A, New England colonies, B, middle. C, yeah. C, economic activities of each region. C is in cat. All right. Moving along. Same, I think we'll finish out the rest of the questions with the same table here. So in which colony might people be more quickly informed about news and events? So that one you kind of have to think critically about. Which region, for starters, do you think news would travel quicker? That's where you start before you think about the individual colonies, right? Imagine news from Britain. Where do you think it would have arrived first? And how does news spread today?
C, Massachusetts.
C, yeah, C, Massachusetts. C is in cat, right? At that point, you're gonna, your population density is how news is gonna spread. It's gonna take a lot longer to get information or news around South Carolina and Georgia, because even though there's more people, it's more sparsely, the population density is spread out, right? It's much sparser. Around the Massachusetts, around the New England area, you get news from overseas coming into the ports there, and it's much easier to transfer because your population density is a lot higher. So C is in cat. for 16. 17. What information could you learn from the passage that you could not find in the table? So A, the number of people living in each colonial region. B, specific examples of large cities in the middle colonies. C, the types of plantations found in the southern colonies. Or D, the industries in the New England colonists worked. So what's in the text that's not in the table, basically, is what it's asking you. So it never says anything
B.
about B. B is in boy. Yeah,
Mm.
specific examples of large cities. That's what's mentioned up here, right? It talks about Philadelphia and New York. Oh, so Philadelphia and New York. That's the only thing that's really mentioned there. There's no other specifics that come up. So B is in boy. 18. The economic patterns established in the colonial era relate directly to which future historical event? French and Indian War, the American Revolution, the Great Depression, or the Civil War? So looking at the economic patterns here. But some of the other information that we've discussed as far as migration, types of population. What kind of pattern are we
Maybe
seeing?
the Civil.
The Civil War, yeah, D is in dog, right? Largely because your southern states, once we gain our independence, maintain those large slave populations because of their agrarian culture, their agricultural society. The North, of course, they had less slaves to start with. They were industrializing. A lot of agriculture began. We started seeing more use of industry for agriculture, and we needed less manpower. We needed less labor to work those farms. And but still the South was holding on to forced labor, slave labor. So that's we're seeing how those traditional and cultural ideas kind of were teased out into the Civil War. So D is in dog. And last one. So which of the following assumptions can you logically make about the reason for the differences among the colonies? Geography and climate played a large part in the differences. The temperate New England climate fostered the growth of large plantations. Let's see what we have here.
Okay.
So A.
Yeah.
Yeah, A in the chat there. Yeah, so geography and climate played a large part in the difference among the colonies, right? That dictated what life was going to be like. What were you going to be able to do in the North? You're going to be able to, there wasn't a lot of farming. So I'm going to go ahead and stop recording here. Maybe I'm going to stop recording. There we go.